Everyone. I want to begin by addressing the news that hundreds of unmarked graves have been found near the former residential school in Cowessess First Nation. This was an incredibly harmful government policy that was Canada's reality for many, many decades. And Canadians today are horrified and ashamed of how our country behaved, about a policy that ripped kids from their homes, from their communities, from their culture and their language, and forced assimilation upon them. This is a piece of our past, of decades past, that resonates and echoes and is and continues to be a lived reality of consequences for many, many Canadians today. So specifically to the members of the Cowessess community and Treaty 4 communities, we are sorry. It was something that we cannot undo in the past, but we can pledge ourselves every day to fix in the present and into the future. And that means recognizing the harms, the impacts, the intergenerational trauma, the cycles of challenges that far too many Indigenous peoples face in this country because of actions that the federal government and other partners deliberately and willingly undertook. I spoke with Chief Cadmus Delorme yesterday, the chief of Cowessess First Nations, and offered all of the federal government's continued support and partnership, not just on supporting the communities that are grieving for the discovery of these graves, but also on the work that we must do to help them heal, to create opportunities to move forward, including on the issue of child and family services. We know that even long after residential schools closed in this country, child and family service, in the stated purpose of protecting children's well-beings, continued to take them away from their communities, continued to remove them from their language and culture, and place them in foster homes in non-Indigenous communities all across the country. That's why one of the calls of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to restore the care of kids at risk to the communities themselves. And in my conversation with Chief Cadmus, Chief Delorme, we talked directly about how we could even further accelerate the great work that Cowessess has already been doing on moving forward on child and family services as an example of the kind of work that is being done right across the country, and in recognition of the terrible time that the community is going through right now. This has come on the heels of the terrible news out of Kamloops, and it has caused a lot of Canadians to reflect on our past and how it has impacts on our present, to have difficult conversations with their loved ones, with their kids, about Canada's history and Canada's present. Truth and reconciliation requires that we start with truth. And we start by recognizing the terrible, terrible mistake that we willingly undertook in the past, taking kids from their homes and communities and leaving them open to incredible challenges and hardship as we tried to remove their languages and cultures from them. With Canada Day coming up next week, a lot of people, I think, will be reflecting on many different things. Reflecting on the really tough year we just had with COVID-19, how much we lost, how much we learned, how much we've been there for each other through difficult times. But at the same time, many, many Canadians will be reflecting on reconciliation, on our relationship with Indigenous peoples and how it has evolved and how it needs to continue to evolve rapidly. We have so many things we need to work on together. And I think this Canada Day, it will be a time of reflection on what we've achieved as a country, but on what more we have to do. So as we gather with family and friends, carefully still, and reflect on our past, we need to understand and remind ourselves that Canada didn't happen by accident, and it won't continue without effort. And this coming Canada Day, I think we all need to pledge ourselves to doing what we can to continue that effort to make Canada better, all the while respecting and listening to those for whom it's not yet a day of celebration. I think all of us need to aspire and work hard to get to the point where everyone across this country will be able to celebrate fully all that this great country is and all it will be able to continue to be into the coming years, and know that if we're going to be that, we all have more work to do, because that's the story of Canada, always stepping up with more work to do. Yesterday, I also talked with National Chief Bellegarde, because tragically, Cowessess is not the only place in this country where children died in the residential school system. It's not the only place where children faced abuse, loneliness, illness, and neglect. So to all families and survivors across the country, I know that no words can right these terrible wrongs. It is with our actions that we need to continue to recognize the truth and to do everything we can to support you. Following the discovery at the former Kamloops residential school earlier this month, we've made $27 million available immediately to Indigenous communities to find and honor children who died at these institutions. For communities in Saskatchewan in particular, like Cowessess, we've reached an agreement with the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations to provide almost $4.9 million to search for burial sites. And for people across the country, we're providing whatever mental health support survivors, families, and communities need for healing. Le système de pensionnat.
The residential school system was designed to erase Indigenous languages and cultures. When I speak with community leaders and members, they often talk about the importance of taking concrete steps to right these wrongs. That is exactly why the Indigenous Languages Act was passed as a critical step on the road to reconciliation. And we continue to move forward. On Monday, I met with the Commissioner and the directors of the first ever Office of the Indigenous Languages Commissioner. We continue to work in partnership to enable Indigenous cultures and languages to flourish and develop. There is much work to be done to rectify the mistakes of the past and eliminate the gaps that still exist today. As a government, we will always be there to do the work that is needed. But we also all need to be a part of this progress and work towards reconciliation. Next week is Canada Day, and it gives us the opportunity to reflect not only on the extremely difficult year that we have just been through, but also on the history of Canada and the impact that it's had on Indigenous communities. There are people who will not want to and who will not be able to celebrate Canada Day this year, and we need to respect them. We need to do more, reflect on the country that we are and the country that we want to be. And we need to know that we all have our role to play in order to be the best country in the world.
I want to share an update about where we are in the fight against this pandemic. And to begin with, I have some good news about vaccine deliveries. We committed to reaching 9.1 million Pfizer doses delivered to Canada in July as part of our summer ramp-up. We've now received confirmation of our July vaccine delivery schedule from Pfizer, and it provides us the clear path to reach that goal. In other words, we're keeping our commitment. Of course, we've shared these delivery details with the provinces and territories so that they can get doses into arms as soon as they arrive. Canada is leading the world on vaccination. Over 76% of eligible Canadians have had at least a first dose, and over 26% have had a second. But let's keep that momentum up. Remember, you need a second dose to stay safe. It's not something you can do halfway. Just like by now everybody knows the mask goes over your nose and mouth, we all have to get that second shot once we've gotten our first. En ce qui concerne les vaccins, on va avoir reçu.
As far as vaccines are concerned, we will have received a total of more than 68 million doses by the end of July. That's a lot of vaccines. And that's the way to beat this pandemic in Canada. On that note, later today, Dr. Tam will present an updated model of case predictions for the coming weeks. Over the past 15 months, these models have not always produced good news. But because people have been getting vaccinated, because people have been staying home and following public health rules, the current situation is quite encouraging. If we keep the momentum going, if we're careful, and if we get vaccinated, the number of cases will continue to go down. And that means we can continue to move forward carefully with the reopening. Get vaccinated when it's your turn. It will protect you and your family and your community, and it will bring us all closer to the end of this crisis.
Now, before I end for today, I want to take a moment to talk to all the kids out there who are starting their summer break. It's been a tough year. I know that. I spent a lot of time watching my grade 1 Hadrian trying to stay focused on a computer with his Lego beside him as he's getting through grade 1. And nobody wants to have gone through an entire school year like this, but so many of you have. You've been incredibly strong. You've figured out how to help around the family, help around the house, help your mom and dad in difficult times, stay focused on school even though it was totally different. You've missed your friends, but you found ways to play with them virtually. We've all made incredible sacrifices this year, but you have made an awful lot as kids. So I want to say thank you, that we're proud of you. Your parents are proud of you. Your teachers are proud of you. And Canada is proud of everything you did to help us get through this year and hopefully end this pandemic very soon. So you've earned a better summer. Yes, we'll still have to be careful, and it won't entirely be normal as a summer, but it'll be pretty great. We're all looking forward to getting back outside and having fun with our friends. And we're going to be able to do an awful lot of that this summer because you stayed focused on helping, on being there, and on getting us all through it. And to parents and teachers, thank you. I know it's really been tough as well. And I know if, again, you're like my household, you're busy thinking about how we're going to get our kids away from those screens that were so integral to their daily lives over the past many, many months, and actually have them play together and play outside and drop some of those electronic habits. But we have gotten through this. We're not quite done. We still need to be careful and vigilant, and will for quite a while. But things are so much better because Canadians pulled together. Thank you for everything you've done, for your kids, for your students, for our communities. Thank you for having their backs as we will continue to have yours. Notre gouvernement a investi des...
Our government has invested billions of dollars to get students, teachers, and staff the help they need. For example, for the Algoma District School Board in Ontario, this funding has enabled a series of upgrades to improve ventilation and lighting. As a result, students will be able to return to safer and more appropriate classrooms. It has been a challenging year for everyone, but we'll continue to invest to make sure that children, parents, workers, and everyone else can come back strong. Thank you very much. I'll now take your questions.
Monsieur le Premier ministre, on va commencer avec les questions au téléphone aujourd'hui. Opérateur,
Thank you. We're going to start with questions over the phone. Operator?
Merci. You may press star 1 if you have a question. Vous pouvez appuyer sur étoile 1 si vous avez une question. This question is from Christy Kirkup from the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead.
Hello, Prime Minister. Will you ensure there is an independent investigation into whether there were crimes and potential cover-ups of crimes at Indian residential schools?
I think people want to properly understand what happened. Canadians across the country are waking up to something that, quite frankly, Indigenous communities and people who've worked closely with the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have long known. That far too many kids, thousands upon thousands of kids across the country, were taken from their families, from their communities, from their homes, sent to far-off residential schools, and never came home, often without information, without any details being given back to their families on what happened to their loved ones, to their children. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has put forward significant calls to action that will allow for a proper understanding of what happened, of documenting, of giving families opportunities to grieve, to heal. And that is something that we are supporting full-heartedly and wholeheartedly as we move forward. We will continue to be there to support the communities in their needs as they grieve, as they work through this, as they get the understanding and knowledge they need in order to heal. We will keep putting Indigenous peoples and their wishes at the center of everything we do.
following up, Christy.
Respectfully, Prime Minister, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was collecting stories from survivors. What they did not have was subpoena powers to subpoena documents from the government, from the churches. And Murray Sinclair, the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, says there now needs to be an independent investigation where individuals have subpoena powers in order to compel the release of documents and to conduct this formal investigation. So to ask again, is there openness on the part of the federal government to launching an independent investigation to determine once and for all if there were crimes committed at the school?
As I have said many times, Kirsty, there is an openness and there is a willingness and there is a desire and a drive in this government to do everything that is necessary to support Indigenous communities, to support all Canadians who want to know the truth, so that we can move forward on reconciliation. We have invested millions in supporting the specific calls to action on missing children linked to residential schools. We have invested billions in fulfilling all the calls to action and working to continue to fulfill them. We are there to be a partner in whatever is needed to find the full truth and ensure reconciliation is possible.
Thank you. Operator, next question on the phone.
La prochaine question de Pierre Saint-Arnaud, la presse canadienne. La parole est à vous.
The question is from Pierre Saint-Arnaud from the Presse Canadienne. Hello, Mr. Trudeau. I would like to come back on the previous question. If we looked at criminal acts, will we move forward with criminal investigations on what happened in residential schools? Answer: we are ready to take all the necessary measures in order to find the truth of what happened and ensure that all the processes are done for individuals and institutions. We recognize that it has been decades hundreds of years that we've had this problematic policy from the government. We want to find the truth, and our resources need to be focused on the present, on supporting those who need it for healing, those who need resources in order to get through this and ensure opportunities for the communities. Our investments are focused on today and tomorrow, but in order to build a better today and tomorrow, we need to understand what happened in the past. Follow-up question? Mr. Trudeau, because you're talking about it, regarding reparation, what can we do? How can we act? There are Indigenous communities who still do not have access to clean water. There are a lot of difficulties in Indigenous communities. What are we looking for there for those communities for reparation? Answer: I know that a lot of Canadians are shocked and horrified by what they've been seeing in the news over the past weeks. And with good reason. What happened is horrifying and shocking. What's been happening to them for decades and generations. But this is not news for a lot of Indigenous people in the country. They've known for a long time that thousands of children were sent to residential schools and were never sent home. As a government, for the last 6 years, we've been working with these communities on reconciliation, on investments to lift boil water advisories. We were able to lift 108 of these advisories throughout the country. There is still work to do, but we've done quite a lot. We opened new schools. We invested in support programs for children. We created bills on protecting Indigenous languages and culture. We want to make sure that at-risk children stay in their communities and stay in their culture the right way. We know that people are impatient for us to do more, and we're here to do more. But we've been working in partnership with Indigenous communities for the last 6 years. It didn't take the horrible news of the coming weeks for us to act. We've been working on this. But of course, there is still a lot to do, and we will continue to be there to do it with Indigenous people. Thank you. Operator, last question on the phone, please.
The next question is from Raisa Patel from the Toronto Star. Please go ahead.
Good morning, Prime Minister. You said a few moments ago that you would be putting Indigenous people at the forefront of everything you do. Some Indigenous groups have strongly criticized Minister Bennett for the text message she sent to MP Wilson-Raybould yesterday. The Union BC of Indian Chiefs has called for her immediate resignation. Do you believe she still has a role in your cabinet after sending this message?
What Minister Bennett did was wrong. It was hurtful. And of course, I'm deeply disappointed. She did the right thing by apologizing because it was the wrong thing to do. As a government, as ministers, as Canadians, we need to be focused on the work that needs to happen for Indigenous people across this country who've been going through extremely difficult times, not just these past weeks, but over years and generations. We need to end drinking water advisories. We need to build more housing. We need to settle land claims and treaties in ways that demonstrate the partnerships for the future. We need to protect Indigenous kids, keep them in their culture and languages. We need to focus on economic opportunity for Indigenous peoples. And these are things that we've all been working on very, very hard. And those are the real important things that we need to do. So I am disappointed by what Minister Bennett did. She has apologized quite rightly. It was wrong and it was hurtful. And we all need to stay focused on the things that matter. And mistakes like this are hurtful and nudge us in the wrong direction instead of steadily moving in the right direction.
Given that Minister Bennett is tasked with...
Just une seconde.
Just a moment, please. I just need to respond in French. What Minister Bennett did was a mistake and disrespectful and caused a lot of harm. I am disappointed by what she did, and it is appropriate that she apologize. Indigenous people in this country are going through very difficult times, and as a government and as individuals, we need to focus on these serious problems that they are facing, whether it be boil water advisories, whether it be investments in children, investments to protect languages and culture. We need to make sure that communities can take care of their children. These are priorities that we have. And unfortunately, what we saw made that more difficult.
Star?
Given that Minister Bennett is tasked with strengthening the relationship between the federal government and Indigenous peoples, what do you say to some members of the Indigenous community who may now be doubting the authenticity of your government's approach to advancing meaningful reconciliation?
I spoke with Carolyn Bennett this morning. I know how hard she has worked and continues to work on this important file. I know her heart. I know the efforts she has put in over years on this. And we both understand that there is now even more work for her to do. And I know we will do it together.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Perry, CBC. You were talking earlier about how far you're willing to go in terms of looking in, making sure there's accountability here. Some chiefs are describing these grave sites as crime scenes. And I'm wondering, if there's going to be accountability, how far are you willing to go? Do you need to see the police come in? Do we need to see international investigators come in? What is your government willing to do?
I think the first thing we need to do is be there for the communities and what they want and what they need and what answers they need to get. These are people who've lost their loved ones, people who continue to feel the hurt of grief, of loss from decades and indeed generations past. Loss that has continued to affect and impact on their daily lives, even if they happened, in many cases, so many years ago. So they will be put at the center of all of our steps. I've heard some people say, you should just go in with bulldozers and dig them up and find out exactly what happened. These are people's grandparents, great aunts, great uncles, loved ones. Respect for them, understanding their wishes, their desires, yes, for answers, for closure, but also for dignity and respect for those loved ones they lost. So every step of the way, my pledge to all Canadians is that we will put Indigenous peoples and their wishes for their loved ones, for their communities, at the very core of whatever next steps we take. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission laid it out clearly. We need truth. We need to understand what happened. There needs to be accountability, absolutely. But that needs to be driven by and based on the choices and desires and needs of the people who are at the center of this, the people who are the victims of this shameful policy and who continue to live the echoes of it every single day. Je pense que
Answer repeated in French. I understand the outrage and the frustration of Canadians that this happened here, and they're just finding out what Indigenous people have known for years and generations. A lot of children went to the residential schools and didn't go home. Now, in order to find the truth and move forward on reconciliation, we have to respect their needs, their desires to heal, to move forward on the right path for them. I heard people say, go in with your bulldozers and dig up the graves. We'll find the children, we'll find out what happened. But come on, these are family members of Indigenous people. We need respect. Perhaps we'll get to that point, but it would be because the families and the communities decide that that is what they need. At every step, we are going to work with them. We are going to be there for them, and we are going to follow what they need for the next steps.
Annie Bergeron-Oliver with CTV National News. You, along with many Indigenous leaders, have called on the Pope to apologize, but that still has not happened. What can your government do to hold the Catholic Church accountable for its roles in residential schools? And could that next step include something like removing the Catholic Church's charitable tax status, even temporarily?
I don't think we're going to get to anywhere near that level of conflict. I have heard directly from many Catholics across this country who want to see the Church play a positive role in this. I have spoken personally, directly, with His Holiness Pope Francis to impress upon him how important it is, not just that he makes an apology, but that he makes an apology to Indigenous Canadians on Canadian soil. I know that the Catholic Church leadership is looking and very actively engaged in what next steps can be taken. And we will continue to be there to work with them, to facilitate things, and to encourage them to keep doing right by Canadians and Indigenous peoples who are very preoccupied by this piece of history. Okay.
Answer repeated in French. I believe that it's important that all institutions that had a role to play be a part of the healing and help us move forward from this reality. I know that there are Catholics throughout the country, bishops and archbishops, that are trying to see what they can do to help truth and reconciliation. When I saw the Pope a few years ago, I explained how important it is to receive apologies, for him to give apologies to the Indigenous people on Canadian soil. And I know that there are people in the Church who are working on that. As a government, we are going to be there to facilitate those efforts. Hello, Mr. Trudeau. Christian Noël from Radio-Canada. Do you think that the government could use the tribunals, the courts, to force Catholic churches to hand over the documents on what happened? And do you believe that criminal acts were committed? Answer. I don't believe that we will have to use the courts in order to force the sharing of these records. I know that a lot of records have already been shared, but if there is more to be done, I am quite confident that the institutions and the churches will want to share this information. Now, with regards to criminal acts, it's quite possible. We know that there was abuse and that children were mistreated in a lot of these institutions. We know that there were illnesses, that children died from natural causes, but in a non-natural situation. They were ripped from their communities and their families. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission talked about this. These children were living in horrible situations, deplorable situations, and a lot of survivors talked about tragic deaths. Some were not criminal, but others probably were when we're talking about abuse, when we're talking about negligence. In a lot of stories, there were criminal acts, and that's part of the reflection that we have to have. I would like to ask all Canadians to learn what they can from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to listen to the stories of the children who survived, and to learn about the children who were lost in those residential schools. These stories have been shared. And some Canadians were surprised with Kamloops and now with Coessess. And we know that a lot of Canadians don't know how this is a big, shameful part of our Canadian history. And we all need to learn about the misery and the hardships that these children faced. We cannot change the past, but we can transform our present and our future in order to do better. Inaudible.
I think as people read the stories, and I encourage Canadians to reach out to look through the resources of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that share heartbreaking personal stories of loss, of neglect, of misery that so many Indigenous people went through in residential schools. There are stories of abuse, of neglect, that yes, obviously have crimes that would be severely punished today. But there are also stories that are just heartbreaking in their sadness, of illness, of disease, of things that you can't directly blame on any one person or institution, but indeed on a system that ripped kids from their homes, from their language, from their culture, from their communities, to erase that culture, to erase that identity. That was the policy of Canada hundreds of years, many, many decades ago. And it was a policy that isn't just part of our past, that continues to have echoes today in challenges facing Indigenous people now, with higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of addiction and suicide, that have consequences every time. Still, Child and Family Services takes a kid at risk and removes them from their community, removes them from their language and culture for their protection. Well, that's not right, and that continues to this day, which is why we worked with Indigenous communities over the past few years to develop Child and Family Services legislation that would keep kids at risk in their communities and give the communities the resources to care for their own kids in their language, in their culture. These are the things that we are working on doing, but there is so much more to do. So even as Canadians are shocked and appalled at our past, so too should they be shocked and appalled at the consequences of that past that exists for far too many still today.
Minister Mike Lukather with Global National. I wanted to know, how can you ask First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities to continue to work with a Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations who should have known better than to perpetuate a racist stereotype about Indigenous people? I mean, when is an apology just simply not enough here?
What Minister Bennett did was wrong, and it was hurtful. There's no question about it. And whatever reasons of interpersonal issues, there's no excuse. And that's why it was right that she apologized. But I know Carolyn's heart. I know how hard she has worked for decades on this issue, and I know how much more there is for us all to do. And I know that she understands how much more work she's going to have to do in the coming days, weeks, and months.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Teresa Wright from the Canadian Press. Canadians, First Nations, Indigenous peoples across the country they want to know the extent of this national tragedy. Isn't it time for you to commit more than $27 million, which, just to put it in perspective, is 0.00567% of this year's total $457.6 billion budget? Or to put it another way, it's half of 1% of 1%. Don't you think that more money should be dedicated toward finding these children and giving their families some peace?
In speaking with Indigenous Canadians, I think it's important for non-Indigenous Canadians to know that as much as there is very real grief at the news of the discovery of these hundreds of unmarked graves, that there is trauma and triggering and anguish in families who are hearing this news, it is not exactly news for Indigenous peoples that thousands of kids went away to residential schools and never came home. That has been known for a long time by Indigenous Canadians. And that intergenerational trauma and loss is part of the story that explains why Indigenous peoples are facing so many struggles today. Challenges around culture and language and identity, challenges around homelessness and incarceration, and lack of economic opportunity. Because the trauma of the past echoes very much today. So I understand Canadians are all surprised and shocked at this news, and we should be. It is horrifying news. But it is not exactly news. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission reported on this years and years and years ago, and as a government, we have been working with Indigenous communities to ensure that we can move forward on finding these graves and establishing records and helping Canadians grieve and Indigenous people grieve. And as I've said, we will continue to give all the resources necessary to track down their loved ones, to give closure, to do what is necessary for those communities. But that is only a small part of what we need to do to make sure that every kid grows up in a safe and supportive household, in his language, in her culture, that kids get to go to good schools, that elders get to retire in dignity and safety in their Indigenous communities, that elders get to pass on traditional knowledge to their grandchildren, that economic opportunity for businesses, for professional development be there for Indigenous peoples, that we settle claims and treaties that have lingered for decades, that we establish self-government for Indigenous peoples, that we protect Indigenous languages, in a real and tangible way. These are things that we need to be investing and have been investing billions upon billions of dollars in the past years and will continue to into the future. So yes, Indigenous communities across this country have my commitment that they will get the resources necessary to recover and document as much as possible these kids in these graves. But they also have my commitment to be there on the healing and the fixing of the generations of trauma that Canadians have all too often turned an eye from, all too often shrugged away from. Reconciliation is not something that is important that we work on the side as we continue to build Canada. It is something that goes to the heart of who we are. And if it took discovering these graves for Canadians to wake up to how much we need to continue to do, then that perhaps gives us a starting point to continue to do even more.
Just following up on some of your earlier comments, you said that when it comes to trying to discover the scope of this tragedy, this national tragedy, you want First Nations to be the ones leading the way. However, I don't think anybody that I've heard of has talked about bringing bulldozers in. And in fact, the FSIN Chief Cameron is calling for a full, independent, and public review of deaths of First Nations children. So is there not something that you could do to take the onus off these communities so that you can help these communities to a national strategy to help with the search and identification of these children?
Yes, yes, we have launched all of our efforts from the federal side to be there to support in the search, in the identification, in the next steps necessary. My commitment to Chief Delorme, to Chief Cameron, to Perry Bellegarde, and to leaders of the Indigenous communities across this country is that we will be there with them every step of the way as needed, and not needed by us, needed by them, to get the closure, the healing necessary to be able to continue to work together on the range of challenges faced by Indigenous peoples.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. C'est ce qui met fin à la
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. This concludes today's press conference.
Merci tout le monde.